All right. Good evening. I'm Gavin Cleesby, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I'm happy to welcome you to our final program for 2022. Although the weather today was frightful, I'm glad to see that we have a good crowd in person here. We also have close to 300 people registered online, so hopefully we have a good crowd on the internet as well. Since this is our final program, I just thought I would mention that in 2022, we hosted 66 different events. Although we don't yet know what our attendance for today is, our annual total is probably somewhere close to 7,000 people attending our programs. So that's pretty good for MHS. The Mass Historical Society is an independent nonprofit. We maintain a fantastic research library with close to 14 million manuscript pages in our collection, including the papers of 3 of the first 6 US presidents. All of our materials available to the public for free. We also host programs like tonight's, either for free or for a small fee. And we've been doing this for the past 230 years. However, we're only able to do this thanks to the support of our members and donors. So if you enjoy our program this evening, I hope you'll come back for future programs. And we also hope you'll consider becoming a member of MHS or supporting us. This evening, we'll hear from Kerri Greenidge. Dr. Greenidge is an assistant professor at Tufts University. She received her doctorate in American Studies from Boston University, where her specialty included African American history and American political history. Tonight, she'll be discussing her new book, The Grimkes, The Legacy of Slavery in an American Family. While Sarah and Angelina Grimke are revered figures in American history, this book shifts the focus to explore the long-obscured Black Grimkes, including reformer Charlotte Forten and journalist, playwright, and poet Angelina Weld Grimke. So I think it's a fabulous project, and please join me in welcoming Kerri Greenidge.
Thank you so much for having me. And I just wanted to say thank you to Catherine Algor and everyone at Mass Historical. It's one of the treasures here in Boston. I'm very lucky to live near it. And I did a lot of research, both for this book and my last book and my upcoming book in these wonderful archives. So thank you very much for having me. I'm going to do a brief talk. I'm going to kind of outline the genesis of the project with some imagery of some of the Grimke family. And then I will open it up for questions. I will begin, I'll go to the first slide, with an excerpt of a poem by Angelina Weld Grimke. So I'll let people read that for a couple of minutes. And I'll get started. In the fall of 1906, when she was 26 years old, Angelina Weld Grimke arrived in Charleston, South Carolina for the first time. The occasion was the 40th anniversary of the Avery Institute, the first accredited secondary school for Black people in Charleston. Originally called the Tappan School after New York abolitionist Lewis Tappan, who helped fund the institution, Avery had long been a source of pride for Black Charleston. The first heads of the school, free Black brothers Thomas and Francis Cardozo, descended from those who Angelina's grandmother, Nancy Weston, referred to as, quote, colored Westons, an influential group of family and kin who led Charleston's free Black artisan class in the decades before the Civil War. Grandmother Nancy Weston was not free until Union troops reclaimed Charleston in 1865, which meant that her own 3 sons were enslaved. Still, she raised Angelina's father, Archibald Grimke, her uncle Francis J. Grimke, and their little brother John to believe in the exceptionalism of this antebellum free Black community. The greatest blood of the South flows through your veins, she often told the boys during those long ago days in their one-room house on Cumming Street. And by this she meant not only, quote, the colored Westons, but what she called the white Grimke families who claims to own us all. The colored Westons helped found Avery Institute in 1866. Thomas and Francis Cardozo's mother was Nancy's sister. And now, 40 years later, Angelina's father and uncle returned to Charleston as the most famous Grimkes in the country to congratulate the Avery Institute's graduating class of newly minted colored teachers. There she is. That spring of 1906, however, as Angelina spent the days after Avery's graduation touring the city with her father and uncle, she couldn't help but reflect on everything that remained unsaid behind the celebratory parade organized in the Grimke brothers' honor. and the congratulatory headlines that peppered the Black press. One of the most concerning things for Angelina was the fact that she saw little evidence of the white Grimkes, as she called them, the source that supported, quote, great blood of the South, whose exceptionalism once sat on the South Carolina Supreme Court and in the Charleston mayor's office. The only public indication of the white Grimke's past accomplishments was a peeling sign for, quote, Grimke's haberdashery, and loud whispers amongst a group of Black women about the state of the old Grimke mansion on East Bay Street. By the time she returned to her own home with Archie and Uncle Frank in Washington, D.C., Angelina couldn't help but feel, quote, a sense of foreboding. As she stated, quote, there is a tale there to tell indeed. Alas, I will never decipher it, although it sweeps over me heavily. How I wish, she told a friend, I had a mother to tell me what I want to know. When Angelina Weld Grimke took that trip to Charleston in 1906, the Grimke name was well known amongst members of Du Bois's so-called talented 10th. Angelina's father, Archibald Henry Grimke, born in 1849, was a graduate of Harvard Law School, a successful attorney, a newspaper editor, and a political appointee who led the Black political independence movement in Boston during the 1880s. By 1906, Archibald, called Archie, had served as consul to the Dominican Republic under Democratic President Grover Cleveland, and he had also founded D.C.'s prestigious American Negro Academy with W.E.B. Du Bois and Alexander Crummell. Her uncle, Francis James Grimke, Archie's brother, called Frank, and Frank's wife, Charlotte Forten Grimke, were equally accomplished. A graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary, Uncle Frank was pastor of D.C.'s exclusive 15th Street Presbyterian Church, the gathering spot for Black former congressmen, real estate investors, university administrators, and federal appointees. Aunt Lottie, granddaughter of one of antebellum America's wealthiest Black abolitionists, was the first Black woman to graduate from a predominantly white college, a veteran social reformer who taught freed people on the South Carolina Sea Islands, and the first Black woman published in the Atlantic Monthly. With her Grimke family pedigree, Angelina Weld Grimke, called Nana, was also on her way to greatness, despite years of adolescent conflict with her father, aunt, and uncle over, quote, her inappropriate relationships, end quote, with women. As a graduate of the Boston Normal School of Gymnastics, a predecessor to Wellesley College, and as a published writer whose poetry frequently appeared in the Colored American magazine, the Boston Post, and the Boston Pilot, and Scribner's, Nana taught English at D.C.'s prestigious Dunbar High School. She also studied casually at Harvard University in the summer and spent vacations and holidays gallivanting around the Jersey Shore and Anacostia, Maryland, with her equally well-heeled friends. Roscoe Conkling Bruce, son of a Reconstruction-era senator and head of the colored schools in D.C., Mamie Burrill, head of the women's department at Howard University, and Maida Vo Warwick Fuller. All these were her friends. Fuller was the wife of the first institutionally trained Black psychiatrist and future sculptress of the Harlem Renaissance. Despite such pedigree, however, Nana Grimke remained privately haunted by the unanswered questions about her family's past, questions that lingered in that Warren Grimke's haberdashery sign and that deteriorating East Bay Street mansion in Charleston. As she told her friend Maida Fuller soon after her return to D.C., quote, there is so much we do not know about the old slave times, and I fear that this will be our albatross. We are all lost in a way, she concluded, the future leaders of the colored race. So when I first started working on the Grimkes, the legacy of slavery in an American family, Nana Grimke's words shaped my approach to understanding this family's long, complicated, and ultimately uncomfortably familiar story. Like many African Americans at the turn of the last century, particularly the so-called colored elite in cities like DC, Philadelphia, and Boston, Nana Grimke was the granddaughter of both the enslaved and the enslaver. Yet she was also the grandniece of two of antebellum America's most famous white women reformers. And I'll switch to this. Sarah Grimke, born in 1792, and her little sister Angelina Grimke Weld, born in 1805, were two of 13 children born to one of the wealthiest and most politically influential slaveholding families in the South Carolina Low Country. During the 1830s, the sisters earned acclaim amongst New England's anti-slavery leaders for daring to speak publicly against, quote unquote, the peculiar institution in which they'd been raised. In fact, Sarah's 1838 treatise, Letters on the Equality of the Sexes and the Condition of Women, and Angelina's An Appeal to the Christian Women of the South, became canonical texts in the anti-slavery and women's rights movements. In 1838, after nearly a year of touring the North, speaking on the duties of white women in public reform, Angelina Grimke became the first American-born woman to speak before a state government when she addressed the Massachusetts state legislature on the need for immediate emancipation and women's right to political representation. After Angelina married the radical anti-slavery activist Theodore Dwight Weld, the sisters moved to rural New Jersey, where they raised Angelina's children, where they ran a series of reform-oriented and integrated schools for children of the abolitionist movement, and where they continued to host women's rights activists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Known as the, quote, first founders of women's rights, according to their 1970s biographer, Gerda Lerner, the Grimke sisters were lauded by their contemporaries for, quote, disavowing their birthright and sacrificing their wealth to support, quote, the cause of the slave. These are the facts that we know about the Grimkes. The accomplished Black Grimke brothers, Archie and Frank, who led Black America at the turn of the century, Archie's daughter, the brilliant poet-playwright Angelina Weld Grimke, and the selfless and uncompromising women's rights activists Sarah and Angelina Grimke, whose lives have inspired one novel, numerous historical monographs, and seats of honor in national and local women's rights museums across the country. And yet, as Nana Grimke pointed out in 1906 after her visit to the Avery Institute in Charleston, there is more of a, quote, tale there than historians and the general public have previously acknowledged. How was it, for instance, I'll go back. How was it, for instance, that Angelina and Sarah Grimke professed horror and, quote, feelings of deception when they discovered their Black nephews while reading an article in the National Anti-Slavery Standard in 1868? This is the Standard story that they picked up the magazine, they read about their nephews, and they discovered them for the first time. According to the Grimke sisters, and repeated by countless historians ever since, they first read about Archie and Frank in an article about Lincoln University, the Black college located in rural Pennsylvania that the brothers attended after the Civil War. According to Angelina, she and Sarah were, quote, horrified to discover that their brother, Henry Grimke, fathered 3 boys with his enslaved nurse, Nancy Weston, who is pictured here. It was this horror, so the sisters said, that led them to meet the brothers, to welcome them into their home in Hyde Park, Massachusetts, and to eventually help pay for their education at Lincoln and for Archie's tuition at Harvard Law School. But according to all of the available historical records, including letters, diaries, accounts by family, friends, and acquaintances, Henry Grimke, their brother, was a particularly brutal and sadistic slaveholder, even for the time. As a child, he delighted in banging slave boys' heads against door jambs, causing one enslaved man named Stephen to suffer permanent brain damage, which eventually meant the Grimkes had begged Sarah and Angelina to bring Stephen north. Brutalized by Henry throughout his life, Stephen suffered from fits and seizures as a grown man, which meant that he wouldn't, quote, fetch a substantial price at market. Sarah, Angelina, and 2 of their other sisters eventually arranged for Stephen to live with them in New Jersey, an act of supposed selflessness that was actually revealing for how unsympathetic the 2 women remained about their family's culpability in slavery's inherent brutality. For instance, when Stephen arrived in New Jersey and couldn't work, due in part to the permanent brain damage wrought by Henry's violence, the sisters complained that he was, quote, lazy and shiftless, while publicly providing him a home and a place to stay. In none of their letters did they account for the fact that Stephen's ongoing difficulties resulted from their brother's history of brutal abuse, a brutality that should have signaled Henry's potential danger to any enslaved woman forced to serve in his household. Then there was the matter of the Grimke brothers themselves. Men who ascended the ranks of the talented 10th, only to reveal in private letters, diaries, and public speeches their disdain for those they referred to as, quote, the Negro masses. Raised by their mother, Nancy Weston, to see themselves as exceptional, both Frank and Archie used the same derogatory language that Sarah and Angelina used when talking about, quote, the lowly slave, to describe what the brothers saw as the creeping immorality, end quote, and, quote, looming irrespectability of those they referred to as the majority of our colored people. As pastor of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, for instance, Frank transformed the institution, founded by John F. Cook as the first African Presbyterian church in 1841. Frank transformed it from a welcoming congregation of, quote, all classes of colored people into a bastion of postbellum, quote, color politics, to use the words of their most famous parishioner, Blanche K. Bruce, a Black senator. Although Grimke transformed 15th Street Presbyterian into a vibrant center of civil rights and community activism, he also policed his parishioners' private lives, suspending women members for, quote, supposed impropriety. He also publicly criticized working class and darker skinned Black residents for their supposed, quote, shiftlessness and tendency to, quote, hang bare armed out of windows and give the white citizens every reason to distrust us, end quote. Similarly, as consul to the Dominican Republic, Archie often referred to the Dominican peasants as, quote, incapable of self-government, darker skinned, and, quote, in need of economic intervention from the Yankee businessmen. Here he sounded more like a racist white northerner overseeing the confiscation of freedmen's lands in the 1860s than a Black man dedicated to racial equality. Finally, there is the question of how the brothers treated the women in their lives, despite Archie's support for women's suffrage and Frank's public reputation for supporting the National Association of Colored Women. Frank married Charlotte Forten, a fourth-generation Philadelphia abolitionist and public intellectual in her own right. But he discouraged her from continuing her public writing after the couple's first and only child, a daughter named Theodora, died in infancy. Although privately devoted to Lottie and proud of her past accomplishments, Frank feared that, quote, the exposure of a pastor's wife would jeopardize the respectability of 15th Street Presbyterian Church. And so Lottie spent the last 40 years of her life as, quote, a colored society lady, supporting equally brilliant and publicly minded Black intellectual women like Anna Julia Cooper and Mary Church Turrell. Archie, meanwhile, raised his daughter Nana with every advantage that his money and political influence could buy. Yet his relentless criticism of Nana's passion for poetry and novels, of her supposed, quote, laziness in school, and particularly of her, quote, inappropriate relationships with women, meant that Nana Grimke grew up constantly failing to meet the requirements of a colored elite obsessed with racial respectability. When Anna fell in love with a man, for instance, an attraction that Archie, Frank, and Lottie should have been proud of, since they did not like her relationships with women, Archie threatened to cut her out of his life forever. The Black man, Archie insisted, was too dark, his work as a musician entirely unsuitable to us as a class of people. We are different from him after all, he told her in a letter. He is of another class than ourselves. The Grimkes, the legacy of slavery in an American family, explores these complexities of what the scholar Saidiya Hartman calls slavery's afterlives by asking questions that are as important today as they were during the Grimkes' time. Today, as we reap the effects of late-stage capitalism and the failed promises of the civil rights and Obama eras, we are living in a similar time that the Grimkes lived through, when the promises of Reconstruction and the end of slavery declined into an era of racial violence, segregation, and disenfranchisement. How does the racial and sexual violence of Southern slavery continue to affect families, communities, and the ways in which Black people communicate with and understand our Blackness? What was the real cost of birthing a postbellum colored elite from the rampant sexual exploitation of enslaved Black women by slaveholding white men? And finally, what does it mean that capitalist accumulation, supposed economic success, and professional achievement have never been enough, neither in the Grimke's time nor in ours, to deliver us from America's racial abyss? So I welcome questions and comments as we move forward. Thank you. Forward. Yes.
Point to this particular family, I was just wondering to what extent this sort of, I'm going to call it caste structure, was found in other African-American families at the time.
So yes, it's a good question. So I'm very careful in the book to point out that the Grimkes were the leader of this class. Again, the class that, Du Bois referred to as the talented 10th. They were sort of the center of this class, and they were covered extensively by the Black press of this class in the time, from roughly 1880s up until the 1920s. And so they were emblematic of this class of people. At one point, Du Bois did a study of this class and sort of estimated that about, and this is Du Bois's estimation in the 1890s, he would say about 1/3 of all members of the Black upper class were more white than Negro. This was his quote. Again, how true that is, I can't personally say, but this was the idea. And sort of the preponderance of people of mixed racial ancestry, particularly African Americans who were the children children of enslaved Black women and white slaveholding men, this made up a majority of the visible sort of Black upper class, particularly in cities like DC and Charleston and Philadelphia and New York. And so the Grimkes were sort of emblematic of that class. And one of the things I sought to do in the book was really point out how their story is really a story of that class generally, and sort of what this class struggled with in terms of their relationship to the slave past, how they dealt with issues of declining status with the rise of Jim Crow and segregation and disenfranchisement. But definitely they were symbols of this class. They were the most recognizable because of the Grimke name. They were very well covered in the press. When I did my first book, the reason why I wanted to do the next book, this book, was because their name was everywhere, right? Every time you picked up like a society page, there was something about the Grimke brothers and they're hosting a party and aren't they amazing? And that, I would imagine, and in the research I did on their family papers, sort of accounted for a lot of the anxieties that they sort of felt and that they exhibited amongst one another.
So did Angelina marry, or did she embrace a gay lifestyle in the end?
So Angelina, the daughter, she never married. She continued to have relationships with women. Her play, her most famous play, is called Rachel. It's considered one of the foremost anti-lynching plays of the era. It's it's written in 1916 and then produced between 1917 and roughly 1925. It's kind of a hallmark of Harlem Renaissance playwriting by women. And that play is all about a Black young woman, Rachel, who discovers kind of her her mother's past of having a lynched father and half sibling, and this protagonist's choice to not have children or marry. And sort of the climax of the play, if anyone's seen it, is her sort of deciding that she's not going to become a mother. And so Angelina, a lot of her work is about that. A lot of her short stories are about that. She did continue to have relationships with women, although for my look at the archive, by roughly 1930, so after her father died in 1930, she sort of led a very reclusive life. Many of her friends, she was sort of this, somebody who traveled in all these circles, vacationed with all these people who were equally sort of phenomenal members of this Black elite. And kind of after 1930, they kind of are all the same mind. She kind of became very reclusive. She eventually moved to New York, worked as a civil servant, and by the 1950s is donating to all of these sort of radical political causes, but rarely leaves her house. So I found no evidence that she had sort of relationships with a lot of people after the 1930s before she passed.
Yes, I was wondering, the color cast part.
Yes.
Did they not come across intellectual dark skin, like maybe a Frederick Douglass or, anybody? Because they're out there. I mean,
Yes.
After all, during that time, we had senators in the South that were dark skinned and so on and so on. And then also, what about their income, especially Archie's? Is Archie? Yeah, Archie, because he's a lawyer. How successful was he?
So the Grimke brothers, both Frank and Archie, were very successful in terms of their career. So Archie graduated from Harvard Law School. He immediately joined a predominantly white law firm, became very involved in local Republican politics in Boston, but then founded a Black law firm with a group of Black attorneys in Boston that was very successful. It kind of one of its successes was negotiating the sale of property in the north end or the north slope of Beacon Hill. The Black community is moving out and arranging it to be sold to the incoming Jewish population. Right? This is very well documented. And so they took a percentage of the cut of the process of selling those properties, right? That was what part of his law firm did. So through that, he made a good living. He was also eventually was appointed head of the Westboro State Hospital out by where I live in central Massachusetts, right near Framingham. Through that, he was sort of on a state salary. So their incomes were very high. As a minister in DC, Frank invested in real estate and actually rented out properties to fellow African-American members of the upper class. So they were in terms of being economically stable and successful, they were economically unstable and successful. In terms of kind of the colorism that you're talking about, they're part of this class, and this is very well documented by historians. I'm thinking of like Jacqueline Moore, Du Bois talked about this in his writings of this class. Kelly Miller, who was a contemporary of theirs, who was a darker skinned African American man. This was kind of the talk of this class of postbellum Black elite at the time, which was that they had been anointed, and I'm using Archie's words here, to lead the race, right? And that this was a project of racial uplift. The kind of subject of racial uplift has been covered by historians and scholars, right? That they had a duty to sort of lift up the masses of Black people who were of a different caste. And they really genuinely, I draw the parallel between, just like the Grimke sisters in the 1840s were genuinely abolitionists and anti-slavery activists. It's not to argue that somehow they're faking it or they're insincere. They were sincere that slavery was wrong and that women should have a place in the public sphere. Similarly, Archie and Frank were genuinely sincere that they had a duty to help uplift Black masses. The question I was really concerned with, and the book is really concerned with, is, well, what is the consequence of that? And what does that actually look like, right? Given the legacies of slavery and the language that people were talking in, right? And, just like the Grimke sisters are sincere anti-slavery activists, they are still talking and referring to someone like Stephen or even their nephews in these terms that don't really account for the role that their family played in where those people were, right? The fact that, why was it that the youngest brother, we haven't even talked about, the Grimke sisters basically refused to pay for his education because they say, well, he's lazy, right? Well, he's not really lazy, he just wasn't doing what they wanted him to do at the time. Similarly, Archie and Frank have all these, they founders of the NAACP, leaders of civil rights activism in Washington, D.C., founders of the American Negro Academy, champions of Black women's rights. So it's not as if they're like bad public people. And yet the way that they're talking about this service is, talking about the Black masses in these derogatory terms. Archie becomes the consul to the Dominican Republic and negotiates a land grant to a company in the United States that basically hastens in the American takeover of the economy in the Dominican Republic. And in his letters, he's talking about that this is a good thing, right? That the Dominican peasants are incapable of self-government, right? And you see he has photographs of himself who looks very much like, is very much a Black or man of African descent, talking about Dominican peasants in this way. And so my concern with the book was like, well, what does this actually mean if this is where these, both the Grimke brothers end up and where the Grimke sisters were, is a very problematic way of viewing themselves and their role and activism and color, right? What does that actually mean if we're talking about this family? And what is the roots of that, right? Why didn't that go away across generations, right? So that it wasn't as, I don't think that you could say that it was as if the Grimke brothers were not exposed to Black people of other skin colors, but they were very much committed to the notion that they were of this exclusively talented 10th group, and that they, as members of this group, and also as members of this group who were descended from mixed race people in the antebellum South, that they were sort of this special caste of people.
I wonder, did Nana ever write an autobiography?
She did not, but one of the best treasure troves of the research was the Moreland Spingarn Library and Research Center at Howard University. And that has the Grimke family papers in it. And Nana Grimke wrote letters and wrote, profusely from the time she was about 7 years old. And is asking her family kind of heartbreakingly from the time she's like a little girl about her family history, right? Because she's learning about from her mother, who's a white woman named Sarah Stanley, which I'll get to in a minute, from that mother that she's never really told that she's Black, kind of a very complicated thing, but she's told that she comes from sort of abolitionist anti-slavery stock. And so from a little age, she's asking, well, if that's the case, she's just asking questions, and nobody will tell her these questions that seem like they should be pretty obvious, but then they aren't obvious because you would have to then talk about the fact that Nancy Weston was enslaved to this brother. So for instance, Nana, when she's a child, asks why her grandmother can't read. If the hallmark of this family is the books and the reading and the studying, and she moves in with her uncle in DC, and Nancy Weston by that time is an older woman and living with Frank, and still weaving the baskets that are traditional baskets of the Gullah women in Charleston, And she asks, well, where is that from? And nobody tells her, right? Don't talk about slave times is what she's told. And then 2, well, why can't grandma read? And why do I have to like write all her thank you letters, right? When everybody else in our family can. The answer is that the Grimke family wouldn't let her learn how to read, right? But you don't talk about that because that then will reveal a different size to kind of these family myths. I was giving a talk in Charleston, and I used the analogy, you know, it's kind of like doing this book was kind of like doing an examination of the uncomfortable silences that we all have, like at holidays, whatever it is we celebrate, that families don't talk about, but is kind of there, whatever it is, right? And this family, that is sort of the stain, that's the American stain of slavery and enslavement in this caste system, right? Nobody's talking about this, despite the fact that this is very clearly where the family comes from, right? The Black family and the white family. The white family are slaveholders, the Black family were enslaved, right? And yet nobody talks about that except in these kind of whispers. And then when they do talk about it, it's all about the exceptional story, right? And so with Nana in particular, she doesn't write an autobiography, but she does write, in the last days of his life, Archibald Grimke brings her to, he was dying, he brings Nana to his deathbed, basically, historian's dream, right? The kind of deathbed convention. And it says he wants her to write down the story of his life. And so it's about 40 pages of just her very hard to read handwriting. I swear that's why my eyesight got worse writing this book. Very like scrawled handwriting in which he's just dictating his life. And that's where you get all of these stories about the brutality. And then, of course, you then have to back it up with the other sort of letters between them. And she writes down, he keeps telling her, the only thing he'll keep saying is that Montague, who was his half-brother, was a brute. And he keeps telling her, keep underlining it. And so you can see she's underlining it. And then he says again, Montague was a brute. Tell them Montague was a brute. So she underlines it again, right? And so that to me is sort of indication, again, sort of family secrets, American secrets that people don't really talk about, you know, the true brutality of what slavery was, right? And how that actually very intimately affects families and communities and people, right? And then kind of, if you don't talk about them or deal with that, it then just goes into the next generation. The next generation then makes what they will of that story or lack thereof. Yes.
I had a professor at the University of Chicago named Allison Davis, who was a social anthropologist. And in my class, there are a number of graduate students who said that he was the first Black scholar to get a position at a major white research university. And there was a biography about him, which just came out a few years ago, called The Lost Black Scholar. Mm-hmm. And my question has to do with, I believe he was from Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. And my question really, I'm just sort of interested in what further light you can shed on this, because I was one of his students, and so I'm kind of, he died a long time ago, but his father apparently had a fairly high-ranking civil service position in Washington, D.C., mm-hmm. Maybe in the Treasury Department. And when Woodrow Wilson came in, he was basically demoted, yes, or almost fired. And so Allison Davis, as a kid, went from a middle-class household to really an impoverished household. Mm-hmm. And it had a profound impact on him. So my question is, he was probably from that mm-hmm. post-bellum anointed group that you described. Mm-hmm. And I just, so you think he also was, because his family obviously struggled with the discrimination and segregation that occurred when Wilson came in mm-hmm. as president. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, so the Black elite, particularly in DC, there's been a lot of work done on them. There's a great book called, by Derek Musgrove, who's a historian in DC, who did a whole book about kind of Black DC and kind of these class distinctions within it, and so they might cover him there. And so I don't know specifically about that person, but this was a feature of that class that the Grimkes often talked about privately in letters, but then wouldn't talk about in polite society, was just how fragile it was to be a member of this upper class, right? So particularly in DC, many people who were members of this class were, as you're saying, federal appointees. And then Woodrow Wilson comes into office and he segregates the federal government in one fell swoop, like within the first couple months he's in office, and that either led to people being demoted or outright fired. And so that had a huge effect on that class. The other thing that happened was, a lot of them taught in the university system. And the university system, of course, was funded in part by allocations from Congress, right? And so if Congress decided for whatever reason they weren't going to fund as much as they would, say, Howard or one of the universities, then, your position, if you were in the faculty of one of those universities, was pretty precarious. And so this was something that was a strand throughout all these letters from like roughly 1880s to the 1920s. The Grimkes, however, their kind of comment was, well, people should have invested in real estate like we did. Right? If you invested in real estate, then you could kind of weather these ups and downs. Of course, kind of a pretty weird way of looking at kind of endemic, poverty and structural issues. But this was kind of their call to arms, was that if you invested in property in the 1880s, you could maintain your position. But of course, most people, there's a very sort of short window in which you could become a Black real estate investor in DC. Yes.
I have a question about Nancy Weston.
Yes.
She was great and not being able to read. She could teach her boys that they were part of the special class. And I want to know how her sons went from being tortured as they were as little children and teenagers to what they became besides Nancy's backing. And then did they ever meet their father, Henry?
So Henry F. Grimke, the Grimke sisters' brother, who's the father of the Black Grimkes, and had this relationship with Nancy Weston, an enslaved woman. Henry Grimke died in 1852. At that point, Archibald Grimke was just about 3, Frank Grimke was almost 2, and Nancy was pregnant with their younger brother, John. So they didn't remember, except Archie could remember his father. And remembered his father allowing their Black mother to give them a name, which was, the Grimkes were very strict that the white slaveholders named all the children. And Nancy said she wanted to name her firstborn son, and so he allowed her to name it. So that was a source of pride for Archibald Grimke. I think, so they didn't, except for Archie, they didn't remember him. Beyond kind of the myths of what Nancy Weston and their relatives told them. In terms of their ability to succeed, one of the things Nancy Weston did, so after Henry Grimke died, Nancy Weston was pregnant. In his will, Henry F. Grimke left Nancy his children, and any future children she should have to Montague Grimke, who was Henry Grimke's white son. And when he did that, when he signed that codicil in his will, and he signed it incredibly 2 months after Archie was born. So it was a pretty, conscious decision that his son is born, Archibald is born. He then goes and redoes his will, right? And basically says, this child and any children I have with Nancy and Nancy herself are to remain enslaved to my son. And so when he died, Nancy Weston is basically left with these 3 toddlers. The remaining white Grimkes don't want to have anything to do with her, don't sell her or do anything with her. They basically tell her that as long as she fends for herself and the boys, they'll basically leave her alone. So she doesn't have any source of income at first. She moves into Charleston. Nancy Weston, the last name Weston, comes from her relationship to this free Black family. So some of them were her cousins. Those helped her build a house on Cumming Street, a 1-room house, and she moves in there with the children. She has John, and then she has to figure out how she's going to support herself. And so how she supported herself was she took in laundry for all of the many white families, including the Grimkes, who would pay her, but then take half of the pay for themselves. And half of the payment she was getting for themselves. So they were getting income from her doing this laundry work. But she then spent the rest of the money on them to go to the school that was run for free Black children in Charleston. So all 3 of her sons, by the time they're like 7, 8 years old, could read, they could write. She would force them at night, according to Archie, to stay up at night reciting the Bible. So they were they knew the Bible very well. So by the time they are, horribly abused by their brother Montague, who comes back in the Civil War, they had a sense that there was something beyond Charleston, right? And Archie talks about this in his deathbed when he's talking about it, right? That he could read. So he could read that what in the newspapers, what was happening in the North, right? He could read that, oh my goodness, there's this secession happening, and this could be a moment where, we could be free, right? So they're very conscious of that. Civil War ends. After the Civil War, the Northern American Missionary Association comes in and starts creating schools for free Black people. Nancy very strategically goes with her sons and says she will work as a chambermaid for free in one of those schools if the school will accept her sons. They go to school there. She basically shows off her sons to the head of the schools, whose last name was Pillsbury. Pillsbury was a very famous family in New England as abolitionists and philanthropists. The Pillsburys say these boys belong in a higher level of education, right? Because they can already read, they can already write. They Archie at one point learned Latin by reading sort of the stuff from the Bible in the back. And so those two, the Pillsburys, arranged for them to make their way to Boston. The boys then are given to foster families. Amazingly, those two foster families initially just wanted the boys to work. And Archie writes a letter to his brother John and basically says, well, it's fine in the North, but we're not getting what our mom said we were going to get, which is an education, right? Instead, one of them is sent to work in a farm in Stoughton, Massachusetts. The other one is sent to Peacedale, Rhode Island. And so within 6 months, and this shows kind of the ingenuity of Nancy, even though she cannot write, I think her son John reads the letter. She gets the letter. She goes to the Pillsburys and she basically says, what about our deal that they would get to go to school? And she bothers them enough that the Pillsburys eventually arranged for the boys to go to Lincoln, which was a school for Black children. So that's kind of how I am very careful in the book to point out that, there's kind of this myth that somehow the Grimke family or white abolitionists were responsible for ushering Archie and Frank sort of to this line of success. And it's really Nancy who was determined, I would argue in both a very positive way, but also in kind of the consequence of that, raising them to believe that they were different, right? Gave them the life and the expectations of their life that they had. On the other hand, right, it gave them the expectations of what the world might look like for other people, right? And so that kind of complicated legacy of that. So they always, as Archie would say, they always grew up believing that they were of this Southern blood, right? The flip side of that is that often, as I talk about in the book, made them believe that, well, if somebody is not succeeding, that must mean that they don't have this Southern blood. They aren't as good, right? Therefore they kind of, it's our job to uplift them because they don't know what is good for them. Yes.
Did Woodrow Wilson offer any kind of explanation for what he did with regard to segregation and why he did that?
He was a segregationist, right? So he basically said, Woodrow Wilson, and I talk about this in my first book, on William Monroe Trotter. Woodrow Wilson was elected as the first Democratic president since the 1890s. He was the first president, as I argue in the Trotter book, to actually meet with a Black delegation called the National Independent Political League. And it was a time when Black people were overwhelmingly disenfranchised, but Black people in the North were considered what we would now call swing voters, right? They were voters where they could vote in the North, would often vote nationally Republican, but locally Democratic. And they were seen as being able to be lured toward the Democratic Party because the Republican Party, as someone like a Trotter would say, had sort of betrayed Black loyalty. Woodrow Wilson, as a Democrat running for president in New Jersey, had a lot of backing from the Black cohort of Black Democrats in New Jersey, and actually met with that delegation when he was running for president the first time. And he promised that he would be as a Moses to your people, is kind of what he says, that he would kind of throw away all of this like sectional conflict and to become this leader of Black people. Well, as soon as he becomes president, he is the president, leader of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was the party of the segregationist South. Woodrow Wilson himself was a segregationist, somebody who believed very much that the South had been wronged, that emancipation had come too soon, all of these things, lost cause, ideology. And so he ended up agreeing with many white members of his party who had been arguing since the 1870s that Black people, number one, shouldn't vote, and number two, shouldn't have a place in office. And so literally one of the first things he does is he segregates the federal government.
We have some questions online. Suzanne asks, do you believe that the Grimke sisters were truly unaware of their nephew's existence until reading about them in print?
I can't say that they were somehow lying that they had met them before. There is no evidence that they knew about the sons. There is evidence, though, that they knew about Nancy, and that, as I chronicle in the book, that they knew the Grimke sisters were very aware of the ways in which Black women were sexually exploited and treated by white men, not just in Charleston generally, but within their own family, right? So this was common knowledge. If you're reading sort of the Grimke family letters, they're talking about their mother, Polly Grimke, is talking about, selling a slave woman because she's getting too close to her husband, and what slave women do, they have sex with white men. And so this was, part of the thing I do, I can't say definitively, there's a letter that says, they knew the nephews existed and they didn't act. What they did know, however, is about the intense and very violent sexual exploitation that Black women went through, and that was a feature of slave society, and particularly Charleston. Charleston was known as a city in which, until 1821, when the laws changed, white men who had sexual relationships with Black women often would bring their Black families to churches. And there were actually separate pews in the Episcopal Church in Charleston up until 1821, where if you were a white slaveholder and you had a common law Black wife, you could sit in this pew with your wife. And it was like, for those few hours of service, no one was going to bother you, right? You would sit there. And this actually comes out later in court documents when many descendants of those Black women sue, because they say, we are actually free people, right? Here's the evidence. We used to sit in this pew and all that sort of thing. So my point would be that the Grimke sisters, as activists, as women who were very conscious of the slave society in which they grew up in, it was impossible for them not to know that Black women were being exploited in their household, in their society. They write about this in American Slavery as It Is, right? They write about this in their own household, if you read American Slavery as It Is, when they're talking in the third person. I knew a woman who such and such. Well, they're talking about their sisters and their mother. So they did know that this was like the common practice. The glaring kind of silence that I was concerned with, which was like, well, if you know that that's the case, what is it about the existence of these nephews would be so surprising? And not just surprising, but the Grimke sisters often then, when they were annoyed with Archie and Frank for whatever reason, would say, well, you're the reason why we're both getting old and dying, right? Because we didn't realize you existed, and your very existence is like a shock to the system, because we never would have known that you would have existed, right? And just that statement, given their whole history within anti-slavery discourse, would seem that would be a little problematic or untrue. So I can't say, they knew that the boys existed and they didn't act. I will say they did know and were very aware, and they wrote about it in their anti-slavery writings, about the exploitation of Black women, both in their own household and underneath Charleston enslavement. And so when they found out about their nephews and Nancy Weston, the way that they then reacted to that discovery was, problematic, to say the least. And the way they reacted to Nancy Weston. So at one point, Nancy Weston was, her oldest boys go to the north. She's left in Charleston with her youngest boy. Eventually, her youngest boy is sent to the north to be educated. And the three boys together asked their aunts, can we raise money to bring our mom north? Because Charleston was exploding in racial violence. Their mother at that point was in her 50s, 60s. She was paralyzed in her arm. They were afraid that she was gonna basically succumbed to a lot of the violence that was happening in Charleston. So they asked their aunts, can we borrow money to bring our mother north? And the aunt's response is, well, no, right? We don't owe anything to her. We're here to support you, right? Again, kind of a very strange way to approach an issue underneath enslavement that the Grimke sisters articulated so well in the 1830s, and yet in their own lives were unable to kind of reckon with how that affected their own day-to-day lives.
We have another anonymous question that says, can you talk more about Nana's mother being white? Did this upper class of mixed race elites often marry white people, and was there any stigma in society in doing so?
So Nana's mother's name was Sarah Stanley. Archibald Grimke, when he was in Boston, he goes to Harvard. He is very involved in local Republican politics, so much so that a Republican office holder gives him a journal that he publishes every week called The Hub. He then becomes a leader in the Black independence movement. He becomes kind of this darling of, Massachusetts and New England politics. Within that, he makes, Archibald was very close with former white reformers' children, who he, for all intents and purposes, he hung out with. They would go together. They went on trips to Maine. And through them, he meets this young woman named Sarah Stanley, whose father was a Methodist minister. Sarah Stanley, they fall in love. At first, before they get married, there seems to be not a lot of controversy surrounding their courtship until they actually got married. And then, Lucy Stone, the famous abolitionist and women's rights activist, is very concerned because she says, Sarah Stanley, be careful. Archie doesn't have a lot to bring to the table, right? He has no money, number one, and he's Black, and what will your children look like? And so they end up getting married, and they have Angelina. Archie was doing very well financially. He moved to Hyde Park to be near Theodore Weld, who was still alive, so that's his uncle, the first Angelina's husband. And Sarah Stanley's family completely disowned her. So when they found out she's married a Black man, they tell her basically, we're saying that you're dead, never contact us again. 1882, this is 2 years after Angelina is born, something happens with Sarah Stanley, the mother, in which she says she's going on a trip to Michigan to see her family. She will be back in a few months. She's taking the baby with her, and then she never comes back with Nana. She's gone for 5 years. It's very unclear what led to this breakup. Some people said, oh, Archie was having affairs. Could have been. I don't really find any evidence of that. Some people said that, Sarah Stanley suffered from mental collapse was the term at the time. And so eventually she raises Nana to live as if Nana is a white child, right? So doesn't tell her that she's Black. And then something happened, again, in the archive, it's very unclear what specifically happened, but when Nana was about 7 years old, she's living in Detroit with her white family. Sarah Stanley says, I can't take it anymore, and basically writes to Archie and says, I need to send her to somebody to be amongst her own people. I've just told her that she is a Negro, right? Puts the child, 7-year-old Nana, on a train by herself and sends her from Detroit to Boston, and she literally shows up on Archie's doorstep. And so that's a long way of saying that one of the things that this project kind of was talking about was the ways in which the traumas of enslavement and of racism and racial caste, as they call it at the time, can affect families in addition to whatever affects families going on, right? So in addition to Sarah Stanley having her own, would now call them probably mental health issues, in addition to them being an interracial couple, in addition to them being a couple who's not getting a lot of support from either side of their family, they're also a couple who, how did they talk about Blackness and race, right? They didn't, right? Their solution was just kind of like, oh, Angelina's with her mom, she's in Michigan. Archie kind of says, oh, I wish she would come back, but okay, you probably know best. And so how did that then carry the trauma then into Angelina's life as a child and then as a young woman who was very, very confused as a little child, like who she was, right? Was she a white Grimke? Was she a Negro Grimke? Was the question she would ask Theodore Weld, right? And he would just say, oh, you're a Grimke. But, what did that actually mean? In terms of interracial marriage, was not legal in most parts of the United States. the state actually that had the highest incidences of interracial marriage from 1865 to 1900 was Massachusetts. That's not to say that Massachusetts was somehow a golden place for interracial couples, but it was the one state where interracial marriage was not specifically outlawed by law. Yeah.
Just thinking about maybe how I grew up and hearing and wondering about my grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't, as is Rachel's, my personal thing, I'll just give you a little bit that I wondered if my grandmother was a slave because she was born in the 1880s. But knowing how that felt and how to ask was something like what you had said before. Did we talk about it? Can we? And so on and so on. And then now she's gone. So my question or my opinion is for the Grimkes having the same feelings as human beings, because we all are human beings and have those feelings. I feel that they were aware, but didn't know how to, and didn't want to have that thrown in their face.
Well, again, I think that's a very good point. I mean, what you're talking about is how do you, again, this is the first generation after slavery ends. The Grimke brothers can remember enslavement, right? So it's not as if it's something that's abstract to them. They're also then going to colleges and schools where they're associating with people who were themselves slaveholders, right? Or survivors of slavery. So this is something that's not as if they're like a generation removed. They are the generation, right? And so then how do you actually, one of the kind of motifs in the book, right, is, well, how then you do talk about that in the moment, right? Beyond the politics of it, beyond kind of the, we have to support the 14th and 15th Amendment, right? Beyond all that, like, how do you just like have a conversation? And how do you deal with that, particularly in a community, say this Black elite, where everybody's family, that's their story, right? Everybody is a member of that Black elite because they come from a family in which one member of the family, a parent, was a slaveholder and the other parent was the enslaved or a person of color, right? And now kind of the rules of that have changed very drastically in your lifetime, right? How then do you talk about it? How do you raise children? What do you say about it if you say anything? There's shame attached to being someone who was enslaved. Was there shame attached to being someone who was a slaveholder? But then it suddenly shifts and suddenly it's something to be proud of, but then it's something not, so what does that mean over a lifetime that you have to actually reconcile that in addition to the politics of dealing with that? I think there's a question in the back.
I was wondering, what year were the family like part of the Dominican Republic? Because I'm Haitian, I was wondering, they didn't know anything about the history that happened in the island, how that nation was already independent, free nation for like years to come.
So the 1894 to 1898, he was in the Dominican Republic, and the Dominican Republic was an independent nation, you are correct. What happens, and this is documented by, I'm thinking of historians who have covered the history of the Dominican Republic during that time. The head of the Dominican Republic, Santo Domingo, as it was often called, was Ulysses Hero, who was a man of very clear African descent. He was somebody who believed that bringing in investment and capital from outside of the island would boost kind of the economy of the country. He and many members of this planter class believed in that. The majority of the peasants on the island in the country, of course, would disagree. And Archie's job as consul of Santo Domingo, like most of the consuls who were brought into the Dominican Republic before and after him, their job was really to negotiate this, right? And one of the things that Archie helped to negotiate was the stalled plans by American companies to basically buy up plantation land, turn them into American-owned sugar companies, right? And use the labor of the peasants to support American agriculture. And he does that, and he was praised, within diplomatic circles for sort of bringing success to that project. At the same time, I note in the book that he's talking about how violent this is for the peasants in Santo Domingo. He's talking about it, though, not as this is violent in a bad way, this is violent. He has all these discussions about how this is just the way civilization works, and within a few years it will all calm down. So it was one of the more shocking things of me as a researcher was reading his reaction to what he's clearly documenting is happening on the ground, but he's not seeing it as something that is a negative. He's seeing it as something that is good for kind of this nation state that he's imagining will eventually come.
The west side of the island, where you were not allowed to have any slave in the island.
Yes, so he would say, his argument was, as many people arguments was at the time, was that there is no slavery. There is no slavery on the Dominican side either. We are not concerned with slavery. Archie would say, we're concerned with bringing industry, right? This is the code word again, would say, to a place that had slavery, right? And so, of course, this is an Archie's imagination. I would facilitate bringing business in because it's not slavery. It's merely bringing in businesses that will guide the way the peasants work. And this is like imperialist, colonialist thing, very violent way of thinking of looking at this country. But he's seeing, he's absorbing in that sense kind of the rhetoric of white rulers in the United States, right? At the same time that he himself, Archie himself, is proclaiming that he is sort of this progressive leader of colored America, right? And so part of that chapter is like really thinking of, how is he seeing himself in this role, right? And he really, as many members of the colored elite in the United States, saw him as like this hero, right? Working class Black people and Black people in both Haiti and the Dominican Republic would say otherwise, but this was sort of the rhetoric surrounding him.
So I want to thank Dr. Greenidge for a fabulous talk. I just want to let you know we have books for sale in the lobby, and I'm sure Dr. Greenidge would be happy to answer additional questions in the lobby as we're signing. But thank you all for coming and joining us, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Thank you so much.